The rain was relentless that Thursday evening, pounding against the windows of our modest two-story house in suburban Boston. I remember thinking how fitting it was, nature mirroring the storm brewing inside our home. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. I sat on the edge of the couch, my fingers absently tracing the frayed edges of a throw pillow, while my husband, Mark, occupied his usual spot at the kitchen table. The air between us was thick with tension, a familiar feeling that had been building for weeks. I watched as Mark scrolled through his phone, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light. His features were set in a rigid mask, jaw clenched tight enough that I could see the muscles working beneath his skin. On the table between us lay a mountain of papers, bills, mostly. Each one felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the conversation I knew we needed to have. "Mark," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in what felt like hours. "We need to talk about your mother's medical expenses." He sighed heavily, putting down his phone. "What about them, Maria?" I could hear the edge in his voice, the defensive tone that had become all too familiar lately. "I've already told you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady and calm. "I can't keep covering these costs. Your mother's care is important, I understand that, but it's not something I can afford to maintain. We need to find another way." Mark's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with something I couldn't quite read. Was it anger? Frustration? Or something else entirely? He pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that set my teeth on edge. "What do you mean, you can't afford it?" he snapped, rising to his feet. "It's my mother, Maria. What am I supposed to do, let her suffer?" I stood up too, my hands clenched at my sides. "That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. But we're drowning here, Mark. The bills keep piling up, and we can't keep going like this. There have to be other options. Maybe we could look into assistance programs, or assistance programs." Mark interrupted, his voice rising. "You want my mother on charity?" I felt a flicker of anger ignite in my chest. "It's not charity, it's help. There's no shame in admitting we need help, Mark." He began to pace, his movements sharp and agitated. "You just don't get it, do you? This is family we're talking about. My family." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. "I thought I was your family too," I said quietly. Mark stopped pacing and turned to face me. For a moment, I saw something soften in his eyes, and I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this together. But then his expression hardened again, and he took a step towards me. "If you were really family," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "you wouldn't even be questioning this." I felt my heart rate pick up, a primal instinct telling me to back away. But I stood my ground. "That's not fair, Mark. I've been supporting your mother's care for months now. I'm just saying we need to find a more sustainable solution." He took another step closer, and I could smell the faint scent of whiskey on his breath. Had he been drinking? I hadn't noticed before, but now it seemed glaringly obvious. "A more sustainable solution," he repeated, mockingly. "Listen to yourself. You sound like one of those corporate robots you work with." I flinched at the jab but tried to keep my voice level. "I'm just trying to be practical. We can't ignore reality, Mark. The numbers don't lie." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes then. Before I could react, he closed the distance between us in 2 quick strides. His hands gripped my shoulders, fingers digging into my skin hard enough to bruise. I gasped, more in shock than pain, as I stared up at him. This wasn't the man I married, the man I thought I knew. This was someone else entirely, someone twisted by stress and resentment and God knows what else. "Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let go of me." For a heartbeat, I thought he might listen. I saw a flicker of something, regret, fear, cross his face. But then his grip tightened, and before I could process what was happening, he shoved me backward with terrifying force. Time seemed to slow down as I stumbled backwards. I saw the edge of the staircase rushing towards me, my arms flailing uselessly as I tried to regain my balance. The last thing I remember is the look on Mark's face, a mixture of shock and something else I couldn't quite place, before the world tilted sideways and everything went dark. As I tumbled down the stairs, a kaleidoscope of memories flashed through my mind. I saw Mark and me on our first date, laughing over coffee at that little cafe downtown. I remembered the day he proposed, down on one knee in Boston Common, surrounded by fall foliage. I thought about the countless nights we'd spent planning our future together, dreaming of the life we'd build. How had we gone from those happy moments to this? When had things started to unravel so completely? As my body hit the landing with a sickening thud, these questions echoed in my mind, competing with the waves of pain that were starting to crash over me. I don't know how long I lay there at the bottom of the stairs, dazed and in agony. It could have been minutes or hours. Every part of me hurt, my head was throbbing, my wrist felt like it was on fire, and my left ankle sent jolts of pain through my entire leg whenever I tried to move it. But worse than the physical pain was the emotional anguish. The man I had loved, the man I had built my life with, had just pushed me down the stairs. It was a betrayal so profound that my mind struggled to process it. How could Mark, my Mark, do something like this? As I lay there, I heard footsteps approaching. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe it had all been a terrible accident. Maybe Mark was coming to help me, to call an ambulance, to make things right. But when I managed to lift my head, the hope died as quickly as it had come. Mark stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, shock, anger, and something that looked unsettlingly like satisfaction. "Stay there, Maria," he said, his voice cold and detached. "That's where you belong, a broken mess, just like the rest of your life. Good luck without me. You'll need it." With those final, cruel words, he turned and walked away. I heard his footsteps retreating, then the sound of the front door opening and closing. And just like that, I was alone. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sounds were the steady drip of the rain outside and my own ragged breathing. Tears began to fall, mixing with the blood I could feel trickling down my temple. For a moment, I was tempted to give in to despair, to just lie there and let the darkness take me. But something deep within me refused to give up. A small voice, barely a whisper at first, began to grow stronger. "This is not where your story ends," it said. "Get up." And so, with every ounce of strength I could muster, I began to move. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't painless, but inch by agonizing inch, I started to drag myself across the floor. I had no clear plan, no idea what I was going to do next, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't stay at the bottom of those stairs. I couldn't let Mark's words be the final verdict on my life. As I crawled, my mind raced. How had we come to this point? When had Mark changed from the loving, supportive partner I married into this angry, violent stranger? Was it the stress of his mother's illness? The financial strain? Or had this darkness always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge? I thought about all the little moments leading up to this, the increasingly heated arguments, the way he'd been drinking more lately, the times I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Had I missed the warning signs? Should I have seen this coming? But even as these questions swirled in my mind, I knew they weren't helpful right now. What mattered was getting help, getting safe. One painful movement at a time, I made my way towards the kitchen. My phone had fallen out of my pocket during the argument, and I prayed it wasn't broken. As I pulled myself across the cold tile floor, I made a silent promise to myself. This would not be the end of my story. Mark thought he had broken me, but he was wrong. I was stronger than he knew, stronger than even I had realized. And I would prove it, not just to him, but to myself. The journey to the kitchen felt like it took hours, though it was probably only minutes. Every movement sent waves of pain through my body, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. Finally, my hand closed around my phone, and I felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline, a way to reach out and get help. As I lay there on the kitchen floor, phone clutched tightly in my hand, I knew that my life had irrevocably changed. The future I had planned with Mark was gone, shattered like my trust in him. But as I began to dial, I felt a flicker of something unexpected: hope. This wasn't the end. It was a painful, terrifying beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The world came back to me in fragments. First, it was the cold. The hardwood floor beneath me felt like ice against my skin, sending shivers through my battered body. Then came the pain, a symphony of agony that seemed to crescendo with each passing moment. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that made it hard to focus. My left wrist was a sharp, stabbing pain that flared with even the slightest movement. And my ankle. God, my ankle felt like it was on fire, sending jolts of agony up my leg every time I tried to shift my position. As I lay there at the bottom of the stairs, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Mark, my husband of 5 years, the man I had trusted with my heart and my life, had pushed me. The shock of it was almost as overwhelming as the physical pain. How had we come to this? I tried to piece together the events that led to this moment. We'd been arguing about money again, specifically, about the mounting medical bills for Mark's mother. I closed my eyes, remembering the tension that had been building for weeks. The late nights Mark had been spending at the office, the increasing frequency of his drinking, the way his temper had become shorter and shorter. Had I missed the signs? Had I been too wrapped up in my own stress to see how close to the edge he was? A sob escaped my lips, echoing in the empty hallway. The sound of it startled me, reminding me of how alone I was in this moment. The house, once a symbol of our shared dreams, now felt like a trap. I needed to move, to get help, but every attempt to shift my position sent waves of pain crashing over me. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. Time seemed to lose all meaning. At some point, I became aware of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps coming down the stairs. For a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe Mark had come to his senses. Maybe he was coming to help me, to call an ambulance, to make this right somehow. But as I managed to tilt my head back, that hope died as quickly as it had been born. Mark stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking down at me. The expression on his face wasn't one of concern or remorse. Instead, there was a coldness in his eyes that I had never seen before. It was as if I was looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. "Stay there, Maria," he said, his voice dripping with derision. "That's where you belong, a broken mess, just like the rest of your life. Good luck without me. You'll need it." The words hit me like physical blows, each one a fresh wound on top of my injuries. I wanted to scream, to rage at him, to demand an explanation. But all I could do was watch as he turned and walked away. The sound of his retreating footsteps echoed through the house, followed by the slam of the front door. And then, silence. The quiet that followed was deafening. All I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the steady drip of rain outside. Tears began to fall, mixing with the blood I could feel trickling down my temple. The salt stung the cuts on my face, a sharp counterpoint to the deeper aches throughout my body. In that moment, lying broken at the bottom of the stairs, it would have been easy to give in to despair. To believe Mark's cruel words, to accept that this was where I belonged. The pain, both physical and emotional, was overwhelming. But something deep within me refused to be extinguished. A small voice, barely audible at first, began to grow stronger. "This is not where your story ends. Get up." It wasn't easy. Every movement sent fresh waves of agony through my body. But slowly, painfully, I began to move. I couldn't stand, my ankle wouldn't support my weight, but I could crawl. Inch by agonizing inch, I dragged myself across the floor towards the kitchen. My phone had fallen out of my pocket during the argument, and I prayed it wasn't broken. It was my lifeline, my only way to get help. As I crawled, my mind raced. What would I do now? Where would I go? The future I had planned with Mark was gone, shattered like my trust in him. But as terrifying as that thought was, a part of me felt relieved. The tension that had been building in our relationship, the walking on eggshells, the constant arguments, it was over. Whatever came next, it had to be better than living in fear in my own home. The journey to the kitchen felt like it took hours, though it was probably only minutes. Every movement was a battle against pain and exhaustion. But finally, my hand closed around my phone, and I felt a surge of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A way to reach out and get help. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the screen. Who should I call? The police? An ambulance? As I scrolled through my contacts, one name stood out: Rachel. My best friend since childhood, the one person who had always been there for me, no matter what. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like an eternity. What if she didn't answer? What if I was truly alone in this? But then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard a click, followed by a sleepy voice. Maria. What's wrong? The sound of Rachel's voice, thick with sleep but immediately alert, broke something inside me. All the fear, pain, and shock of the past hours came pouring out in a rush of words. Rachel, I need help. Mark, he pushed me down the stairs. I'm hurt. I don't know what to do. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line, and then Rachel's voice came back, sharp with alarm and determination. Oh my God, Maria. Are you safe now? Is he still there? He's gone, I managed to choke out. But I can't move. Everything hurts. Okay, listen to me, Rachel said, her voice steady and reassuring. I'm on my way. Don't try to move anymore, okay? Just stay where you are. I'm going to call an ambulance, and I'll meet you at the hospital. You're going to be okay, Maria. I promise. As I lay there on the kitchen floor, phone clutched to my ear like a lifeline, I felt a glimmer of hope. Rachel was coming. Help was on the way. I wasn't alone. The next half hour passed in a blur. True to her word, Rachel arrived in record time, bursting through the front door with a paramedic team close behind. I remember the look of horror on her face when she saw me, quickly replaced by a mask of determination as she helped the paramedics assess my injuries. The ride to the hospital was a haze of pain and fear, punctuated by the wail of the ambulance siren and the steady pressure of Rachel's hand in mine. She never let go, not even when we arrived at the emergency room and I was whisked away for x-rays and examinations. Hours later, I lay in a hospital bed, my injuries treated and bandaged. My wrist was fractured, my ankle severely sprained, and I had sustained a concussion. But I was alive. More importantly, I was safe. Rachel sat in a chair beside my bed, her face drawn with worry and fatigue. She hadn't left my side once, not even when the police came to take my statement. As I looked at her, I felt a wave of gratitude so strong it brought fresh tears to my eyes. Thank you, I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. Rachel squeezed my hand gently. You don't need to thank me, Maria. That's what friends are for. I'm just glad you called me. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the hospital window, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, both physical and emotional. The fear and uncertainty about the future hadn't gone away. But lying there in that hospital bed, with Rachel by my side, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would never set foot in that house again without a plan. This wasn't the end of my story. It was a painful, terrifying beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. And whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. As I drifted off into an exhausted sleep, I held on to that thought like a promise. The worst was over. Now, it was time to heal, to rebuild, and to rediscover the strength I had forgotten I possessed. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was ready to take the first step. Because now I knew I was stronger than Mark thought. Stronger than even I had believed. And that strength would carry me forward, into whatever the future held. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor and the muffled sounds of the bustling hallway outside. I lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing despite the fog of pain medication. The events of the past 24 hours played on a loop in my head, each replay bringing a fresh wave of pain and disbelief. Rachel had stepped out to grab some coffee, leaving me alone with my thoughts for the first time since she'd arrived at the house. The solitude was both a relief and a terror. On one hand, I needed time to process everything that had happened. On the other, being alone meant facing the full weight of my new reality. My body ached all over, a constant reminder of what Mark had done. The doctors had confirmed what I already knew. a fractured wrist, a severely sprained ankle, and a concussion. But it was the invisible wounds that worried me most. How does one heal from a betrayal so profound? As I lay there, I couldn't help but think about Mark. Where was he now? Did he regret what he'd done, or was he angry that I'd sought help? The thought of him potentially coming to the hospital sent a chill down my spine. I needed to plan my next move, and fast. The door creaked open, and I tensed instinctively before realizing it was just Rachel returning with 2 steaming cups of coffee. She set them down on the bedside table and took her seat next to me, her face etched with concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked, though we both knew it was a loaded question. I attempted a smile, but it felt more like a grimace. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I replied, trying for levity but failing miserably. "Rachel, I don't know what to do next." She reached out and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "You don't have to figure it all out right now, Maria. The important thing is that you're safe." Safe. The word echoed in my mind. Was I really safe? Mark was still out there, and the thought of facing him again filled me with dread. As if reading my thoughts, Rachel spoke again. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice cautious. "You can't go back to that house, Maria. It's not safe. I want you to come stay with me for a while." The offer hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to accept immediately, to cling to this lifeline Rachel was offering. But another part hesitated. Staying with Rachel meant accepting that my marriage was truly over, that the life I'd built with Mark had crumbled beyond repair. I don't know, Rachel," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What about my things? My job? I can't just disappear." Rachel's expression hardened slightly. "Your safety is more important than things, Maria. As for your job, we can figure that out. You have sick leave, right? Use it. Give yourself time to heal and plan your next steps." As I listened to Rachel's words, something inside me shifted. She was right. I couldn't go back to that house, couldn't pretend that things could ever be the same. It was time to take control of my life, to make decisions for myself rather than trying to appease Mark or maintain a facade of normalcy. "Okay," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I'll stay with you. But we need to plan this carefully. I don't want Mark to know where I am." Rachel nodded, a look of relief washing over her face. "We'll figure it out together. First things first, though. The police want to talk to you again. Do you feel up to it?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Yes. I think I'm ready to tell them everything." The next few hours were a blur of activity. 2 officers came to take my statement, their faces grim as I recounted not just the events of the previous night, but the escalating pattern of emotional abuse that had led to it. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For too long, I'd kept Mark's behavior a secret, making excuses and hiding the truth from even my closest friends. Now, finally, it was all coming to light. After the police left, promising to follow up and advising me on how to get a restraining order, Rachel and I began to plan my escape in earnest. We decided that she would go to the house to pack some of my essentials while I was still in the hospital. It wasn't ideal, but it was safer than me returning there. "Make sure you're not alone," I told her, anxiety gnawing at my stomach. "Take your brother with you, or ask one of the officers to accompany you." Rachel assured me she would be careful. As she left to make the arrangements, I found myself alone again, but this time with a sense of purpose. I reached for my phone, wincing at the pain in my wrist, and began making calls. First, I contacted my boss, explaining that I'd had an accident and needed to take some time off. She was understanding, assuring me that my job would be waiting for me when I was ready to return. Next, I called my bank to freeze my joint accounts with Mark and open a new one in my name only. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. As I worked through my mental checklist, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, certainly I was under no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be. But also, surprisingly, a sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I was making decisions for myself, taking control of my own life. The day passed in a whirlwind of preparations and medical checkups. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted but determined. Rachel returned, triumphant, with 2 suitcases of my belongings and the news that she'd enlisted the help of a police officer to pack my things. "No sign of Mark," she reported, and I felt a mixture of relief and a strange, unexpected pang of sadness. Part of me had hoped he'd be there, that he'd beg for forgiveness, that there would be some explanation that could make this all make sense. But I pushed that thought aside. That was the old Maria, the one who made excuses for Mark's behavior. The new Maria knew better. As night fell, the doctor came in for a final check. To my surprise, he declared that I was well enough to be discharged, provided I had someone to look after me. Rachel immediately volunteered, and within an hour, I found myself being wheeled out of the hospital. The cool night air hit me as we exited the building, and I took a deep breath, savoring the sense of freedom. Rachel helped me into her car, carefully arranging my crutches in the back seat. As we pulled out of the hospital parking lot, I looked back at the building that had been my sanctuary for the past day. It felt like I was leaving more than just a hospital behind. I was leaving behind the Maria who had let herself be pushed around, both literally and figuratively. The Maria who had made excuses for her husband's behavior, who had put his needs and his family's needs above her own. "Ready?" Rachel asked, glancing over at me as we stopped at a red light. I nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "Ready." As we drove through the streets of Boston, heading towards Rachel's apartment in Cambridge, I felt a mix of emotions washing over me. Fear of the unknown future, grief for the life and love I had lost, anger at Mark for his betrayal. But underneath it all, there was a flicker of something else. Hope. Hope for a future where I could be strong, independent, and free from fear. The city lights blurred as we crossed the Charles River, and I felt tears pricking at my eyes. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of relief, of release. This was my escape. Not just from a dangerous situation, but from a life that had slowly been suffocating me. As Rachel's car wound through the familiar streets of Cambridge, I made a silent promise to myself. This was a new beginning, a chance to rediscover who I was without Mark's influence overshadowing every aspect of my life. The road ahead would be difficult, I knew that. There would be legal battles, emotional hurdles, and the long process of healing, both physically and mentally. But as we pulled up to Rachel's apartment building, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was the first step on a long journey, but I wasn't walking it alone. With Rachel's support and my newfound determination, I was ready to face whatever came next. The old Maria had fallen down those stairs, but a stronger, braver Maria was rising from the ashes of that fall. As Rachel helped me out of the car, I took one last look at the Boston skyline in the distance. Somewhere out there was the house I had shared with Mark, the life I was leaving behind. But here, in this moment, was my future. Uncertain, yes, but full of possibility. "Welcome home," Rachel said softly as we approached her building. Home. The word echoed in my mind as we made our way inside. It wasn't just a place, I realized. It was a feeling of safety, of being true to oneself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly coming home to myself. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to filter through the curtains of Rachel's guest room when I woke up. For a moment, I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings causing a brief surge of panic. Then, as the events of the past few days came rushing back, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread settle over me. I was safe. I was away from Mark. But what came next? Gingerly, I sat up in bed, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. The bruises from my fall down the stairs had blossomed overnight, painting my skin in shades of purple and blue. My wrist ached in its cast, and my ankle throbbed dully. But it was the emotional pain that hit hardest, the betrayal, the fear, the uncertainty of my future. As I sat there, staring at the sunlight dancing on the wall, Mark's parting words echoed in my head, "Stay there, Maria. That's where you belong, a broken mess, just like the rest of your life. Good luck without me. You'll need it." The words stung, reopening wounds that were still raw. But as I repeated them in my mind, something shifted. Instead of pain, I felt a spark of anger ignite within me. Who was he to decide where I belonged? Who was he to label me a broken mess? With a determination I didn't know I possessed, I reached for the crutches leaning against the bedside table. It took some maneuvering, but I managed to get to my feet and make my way to the small desk in the corner of the room. There, I found a notepad and pen that Rachel must have left for me. Sitting down carefully, I began to write. At first, it was just a stream of consciousness, all the thoughts and feelings I'd been bottling up for so long. But as I wrote, a plan began to take shape. I wasn't going to let Mark's words define me. I was going to take control of my life, starting now. I was so engrossed in my writing that I barely noticed Rachel knocking on the door. She entered quietly, carrying a tray with coffee and toast. "Hey," she said softly, setting the tray down on the desk. "How are you feeling?" I looked up at her, and for the first time in days, I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. "I'm okay," I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. "I've been thinking, Rachel. I need to make some decisions." Rachel pulled up a chair next to me, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. "What kind of decisions?" I took a deep breath. "I need to report what Mark did. Not just to the police, I mean really report it. I need to press charges." The words hung in the air between us. Rachel's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded encouragingly. "Are you sure? That's a big step, Maria." "I'm sure," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's not just about me anymore. What if he does this to someone else? I can't let that happen. And I need to do this for myself too. To show myself that I'm not the broken mess he thinks I am." Rachel reached out and squeezed my hand gently. "You're one of the strongest people I know, Maria. If this is what you want to do, I'm behind you 100%. Her support bolstered my resolve. We spent the next hour outlining a plan of action. Rachel would contact the police to arrange for me to give a full statement. We'd also reach out to a lawyer. One of Rachel's college friends specialized in domestic violence cases and had offered her services. As we talked, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For so long, I'd been carrying the burden of Mark's abuse alone, making excuses and hiding the truth. Now, finally, I was taking steps to break free. By the time afternoon rolled around, things were in motion. The police had scheduled an interview for the following day, and Rachel's lawyer friend, Sarah, was coming over to discuss my options. As we waited for Sarah to arrive, Rachel and I sat in her small living room, mugs of tea warming our hands. The TV was on low in the background, tuned to a local news channel. I was only half listening until a familiar name caught my attention. In local news, Boston-based tech executive Mark Andrews has been reported missing by his colleagues. Andrews was last seen leaving his office on Thursday evening. Anyone with information is urged to contact the authorities. The mug slipped from my hands, shattering on the hardwood floor. Rachel jumped up, quickly muting the TV and kneeling beside me. "Maria, are you okay?" I couldn't speak. My mind was reeling. Mark was missing. What did that mean? Had something happened to him? Or was this some kind of twisted game he was playing? Before I could gather my thoughts, there was a knock at the door. Sarah had arrived. The next few hours were a blur of legal terms and strategic planning. Sarah was compassionate but direct, laying out the realities of pressing charges and seeking a restraining order. She also addressed the new complication of Mark's reported disappearance. "This doesn't change anything legally," Sarah assured me. "If anything, it might work in our favor. But we need to be prepared for any scenario." As Sarah talked, I found myself becoming more and more certain of my decision. Yes, pressing charges would be difficult. Yes, there would be scrutiny and skepticism. But it was the right thing to do, not just for me, but for any other woman who might fall victim to Mark's abuse in the future. By the time Sarah left, night had fallen. Rachel ordered takeout, insisting that I needed to eat something substantial. As we sat at her small kitchen table, picking at cartons of Chinese food, she looked at me with concern. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Really?" I took a moment to consider the question. How was I feeling? Scared, certainly. Overwhelmed, definitely. But underneath it all, there was something else, a sense of purpose, of rightness. "I'm okay," I said finally. "I know this isn't going to be easy. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing the right thing. Like I'm taking back control of my life. Rachel reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Maria. You're so much stronger than you give yourself credit for. As we cleaned up after dinner, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number, but I knew instantly who it was from. You think you can just walk away? This isn't over, Maria. Not by a long shot. My hands shook as I showed the message to Rachel. Her face hardened as she read it. That's it, she said, her voice steely. We're calling the police right now. This is harassment. As Rachel dialed the number, I sat down heavily on the couch. The text had shaken me, bringing back all the fear and uncertainty I'd been trying to push away. But as I listened to Rachel relaying the situation to the police, I felt that spark of determination reignite. Mark thought he could intimidate me into silence. He thought he could control me, even from afar. But he was wrong. His actions, his words, they didn't define me. I did. When Rachel hung up the phone, she sat down next to me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. The police are sending someone over to take a statement. They're taking this seriously, Maria. I nodded, leaning into her embrace. Thank you, I said softly. For everything. As we waited for the police to arrive, I thought about the decision I'd made. To press charges. To speak out. To reclaim my life. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But I knew, deep in my heart, that it was the right choice. Mark's text, meant to frighten me into submission, had only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions anymore. I was going to face this head-on, with courage and determination. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt hope. Hope for justice. Hope for healing. Hope for a future where I could be truly free. As the sound of a police siren approached in the distance, I took a deep breath. This was it. The moment where I would officially put my decision into action. I was scared, yes. But I was ready. Ready to tell my story. Ready to seek justice. Ready to show the world, and myself, that I was so much more than Mark's cruel words. I was a survivor, and this was just the beginning of my journey. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Between giving my statement to the police, meeting with Sarah to discuss legal strategies, and trying to navigate the emotional rollercoaster I found myself on, I barely had time to breathe. Rachel was my rock through it all, offering unwavering support and a safe haven in her small Cambridge apartment. It was on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident, that everything changed again. I was sitting at Rachel's kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through job listings on my laptop. The cast on my wrist made typing a challenge, but I was determined to start rebuilding my life, one small step at a time. The sharp trill of Rachel's landline cut through the quiet morning. Rachel, who was getting ready for work, answered it in the other room. I couldn't make out the words, but something in her tone made me look up. A moment later, she appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. Maria, she said, her voice carefully controlled, that was the police. They've found Mark. The mug slipped from my grasp, spilling lukewarm coffee across the table. I barely noticed. Found him? I repeated, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. What do you mean, found him? Where? Rachel came to sit beside me, her movements slow and deliberate as if approaching a frightened animal. He turned himself in at the police station this morning. They're holding him now, but... She hesitated, then continued, they want you to come in. To identify him and potentially confront him. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mark had turned himself in? After days of silence, of fear and uncertainty, he had just walked into a police station? It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. I don't understand, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Why would he do that? And why do they need me to identify him? They know what he looks like. Rachel shook her head. I don't know, Maria. But Sarah thinks it might be a good idea for you to go. To show that you're not afraid, that you're willing to face him. It could strengthen our case. Our case. The words echoed in my mind. This wasn't just about facing Mark anymore. It was about justice, about standing up not just for myself but for every other person who had ever been in my position. I took a deep breath, squaring my shoulders. "Okay," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "I'll go." The drive to the police station was tense. Rachel had taken the day off work to accompany me, and I was grateful for her presence. As we navigated the busy Boston streets, I tried to prepare myself for what was to come. What would I say to Mark? What would he say to me? The possibilities whirled through my mind, each scenario more anxiety-inducing than the last. Before I knew it, we were pulling into the parking lot of the station. Sarah was waiting for us at the entrance, her professional demeanor a comforting contrast to the chaos in my mind. "Remember," she said as we walked inside, "you don't have to say anything to him if you don't want to. This is about identifying him and showing the police that you're cooperating fully. You're in control here, Maria." I nodded, clinging to her words like a lifeline. I was in control. Not Mark. Me. The interior of the station was a flurry of activity. Officers moved purposefully from desk to desk, phones rang incessantly, and the air was filled with the low hum of voices. We were led to a small, windowless room with a large mirror on one wall. I knew without being told that it was a two-way mirror. "Are you ready?" the detective asked, his hand on the door handle. I took a deep breath, looking at Rachel and Sarah. They both nodded encouragingly. "I'm ready," I said. The detective opened the door, and there he was. Mark sat at a metal table, his hands folded in front of him. He looked smaller somehow. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his hair unkempt and his clothes wrinkled. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. When he looked up and saw me, I expected to see anger, or perhaps that cold disdain I'd grown so accustomed to. Instead, I saw something I'd never expected: fear. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The air in the room felt thick, charged with unspoken words and raw emotion. Then, surprisingly, it was Mark who broke the silence. "Maria," he said, his voice hoarse. I'm sorry." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sorry? After everything he'd done, everything he'd put me through, he thought sorry was enough. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, hot and fierce. But beneath it was something else, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "Sorry doesn't cut it, Mark," I said, my voice low but firm. "You pushed me down the stairs. You left me there, broken and alone. You threatened me. Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it." Mark flinched at my words, his eyes dropping to the table. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't. I don't know what happened to me. The stress, the drinking, it's no excuse, I know that. But I want to make it right. That's why I turned myself in." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Make it right? How exactly do you plan to do that, Mark? You can't undo what you did. You can't take away the fear, the pain, the betrayal." He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine. "No, I can't. But I can accept the consequences of my actions. I can plead guilty, save you the stress of a trial. I can get help, real help, so I never do this to anyone else." I felt Rachel stiffen beside me, and I knew what she was thinking. This could be a trick, a ploy to gain sympathy or manipulate the situation. But as I looked at Mark, really looked at him, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse. It didn't change anything, of course. It didn't erase what he'd done or heal the wounds he'd inflicted. But it was something. "I appreciate that you turned yourself in," I said finally. "But you're right, it doesn't excuse what you did. I'm pressing charges, Mark. Not just for me, but for every other person who's ever been in my position. This ends here." Mark nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. "And I think you're doing the right thing, Maria. I know it might not mean much coming from me, but I'm proud of you. You're so much stronger than I ever gave you credit for." The words, so similar to what Rachel had said to me just days ago, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. I blinked them back, refusing to let him see me cry. "You're right," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "It doesn't mean much coming from you. But I don't need your validation anymore, Mark. I know who I am, and I know my worth. And it has nothing to do with you. With that, I turned to leave. As I reached the door, I paused, looking back at the man I had once loved, the man who had nearly destroyed me. Goodbye, Mark, I said softly. I hope you get the help you need. And then I walked out, my head held high. Rachel and Sarah followed, their presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. As we stepped out of the police station into the bright Boston sunlight, I felt as though a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The confrontation with Mark hadn't gone at all how I'd expected, but somehow, it had been exactly what I needed. You did great in there, Sarah said, squeezing my arm gently. That took a lot of courage. Rachel nodded in agreement. I'm so proud of you, Maria. You stood your ground and spoke your truth. That's no small thing. I smiled at them both, feeling a surge of gratitude for these women who had become my support system. Thank you, I said. I couldn't have done it without you both. As we walked to the car, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The fear, the pain, the uncertainty, it had all led to this moment. A moment where I had faced my abuser and come out stronger. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be legal battles to face, wounds both physical and emotional to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hope. Hope for justice, hope for healing, and hope for a future where I could be truly free. As Rachel started the car, I took one last look at the police station. This wasn't the end of my story, I realized. It was just the beginning. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it head-on. The months following my confrontation with Mark were a whirlwind of activity, each day bringing new challenges and small victories. As I sat in the sun-drenched courtroom, waiting for the judge to deliver the verdict, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The legal process had been grueling. There were depositions to give, evidence to review, and countless meetings with Sarah, my steadfast lawyer. Each step of the way, I had to relive the trauma of that night, describing in painstaking detail how my husband, the man I had once loved and trusted, had pushed me down the stairs and left me for dead. But with each retelling, I found my voice growing stronger. The fear and shame that had once threatened to consume me began to fade, replaced by a steely determination. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for every person who had ever felt trapped in an abusive relationship, every voice that had been silenced by fear. Rachel remained my rock throughout it all. She had insisted I continue staying with her, turning her small guest room into my sanctuary. On the nights when the nightmares were too much, when the weight of everything threatened to crush me, she was there with a cup of tea and a listening ear. You're not alone in this, Maria, she would remind me, her voice firm but gentle. We're in this together. And we were. Rachel, Sarah, my family who had rallied around me once they learned the truth, the support group for domestic violence survivors that I had started attending, they all became my lifelines, my chosen family. Healing wasn't a linear process, I discovered. There were good days when I felt invincible, ready to take on the world. And there were bad days when getting out of bed felt like an insurmountable task. The physical wounds healed faster than the emotional ones. Long after the cast came off my wrist and I could walk without a limp, I still found myself flinching at sudden movements or fighting back panic in crowded spaces. That's when I decided to start seeing a therapist. Dr. Lydia Chen became another crucial part of my support system. Our weekly sessions were challenging but transformative. She helped me unpack years of emotional abuse, teaching me to recognize the subtle ways Mark had manipulated and controlled me. You're not broken, Maria, Dr. Chen would say, her kind eyes meeting mine. You're healing. And that takes time and patience. Slowly but surely, I began to rediscover myself. The Maria who existed before Mark, the one who had dreams and ambitions of her own. I started painting again, something I had given up early in our marriage because Mark had deemed it a waste of time. The feel of a brush in my hand, the smell of oils and turpentine, it awakened something in me that I thought had been lost forever. I also threw myself into my work with a newfound passion. My boss had been incredibly understanding throughout the entire ordeal, holding my position for me. When I returned, it was with a fire in my belly. I pitched new ideas, took on challenging projects, and even mentored a young intern who reminded me so much of my younger self. As the trial date approached, my anxiety spiked. The thought of facing Mark again, of having to relive everything in front of a courtroom full of strangers, was almost unbearable. But I drew strength from the community I had built around me. The night before the trial, Rachel organized a small gathering at her apartment. Sarah was there, along with a few women from my support group and my sister, who had flown in from Chicago to be with me. "We just wanted you to know how proud we are of you," my sister said, pulling me into a tight hug. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you've already won. You survived, Maria. You're here, and you're stronger than ever." Her words stayed with me as I entered the courtroom the next morning. As I took my seat, I caught sight of Mark being led in by guards. He looked small in his ill-fitting suit, a far cry from the imposing figure that had once dominated my life. Our eyes met briefly, and I was surprised to find that the sight of him no longer filled me with fear. Instead, I felt a wave of pity, followed by a surge of pride in how far I had come. The trial itself was a blur of testimonies and cross-examinations. I listened as friends and neighbors recounted incidents they had witnessed, as medical experts detailed my injuries, as a forensic accountant laid out the financial abuse I had endured. When it was my turn to testify, I stood tall, my voice clear and unwavering as I told my story. And now, here we were. The jury had deliberated, and the judge was ready to announce the verdict. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak. In the case of the Commonwealth versus Mark Andrews, on the charge of assault and battery with intent to cause grievous bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp went up from the gallery, followed by a burst of muffled sobs. It took me a moment to realize they were coming from me. Rachel's arm was around my shoulders, and Sarah was squeezing my hand, but I barely registered their presence. All I could focus on was the word echoing in my head: guilty, guilty, guilty. As the judge continued, detailing the sentence, 5 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation and mandatory counseling, I found myself looking at Mark. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. A part of me had expected to feel triumphant in this moment, but instead, I just felt relief. It was over. Really, truly over. The next few hours passed in a blur of hugs, tears, and congratulations. There were interviews with victim advocates, paperwork to sign, and a brief press conference where Sarah made a statement on my behalf. By the time we left the courthouse, the sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. "What do you want to do now?" Rachel asked as we stood on the courthouse steps. "We could go out to dinner, celebrate." I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. "Actually, if it's okay with you, I think I'd like to go home. To my home." Rachel's eyes widened in understanding. "Are you sure? Do you want me to come with you?" "No," I said, surprised by how certain I felt. "This is something I need to do on my own." An hour later, I stood on the front porch of the house I had once shared with Mark. The key felt heavy in my hand as I slid it into the lock. For a moment, I hesitated. So many memories, good and bad, lived within these walls. But I wasn't here to dwell on the past. I was here to reclaim my space, my life. As I stepped inside, I was struck by how different everything looked. The furniture was the same, the pictures still hung on the walls, but it all felt smaller somehow. Less intimidating. I made my way through each room, touching familiar objects, opening windows to let in the fresh evening air. In the bedroom, I paused by the dresser. There, in a silver frame, was a photo of Mark and me on our wedding day. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. With gentle hands, I removed the photo from the frame and tucked it into a drawer. It was part of my history, yes, but it no longer defined me. In its place, I set a small painting I had brought with me, my first completed work since I had started painting again. It wasn't perfect, just a simple landscape of the Charles River at sunset, but to me, it represented everything I had overcome, everything I had reclaimed. As I stood there, looking at my painting in the spot where Mark's image had once dominated, I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. This house, once a prison of fear and pain, could be a home again. My home. I made my way back downstairs and out onto the back porch. The night was clear, stars twinkling overhead. In the distance, I could hear the faint sounds of the city, car horns, distant music, the rumble of the tea. The sounds of life going on. And isn't that what I had fought so hard for? The right to live, to truly live, free from fear and control. As I stood there, breathing in the cool night air, I felt a smile spread across my face. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely excited about the future. I didn't know exactly what that future held. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. The journey of healing was far from over. But I knew now that I had the strength to face whatever came my way. I had survived. I had risen above. And now, finally, I was free to soar. As I locked up the house and made my way back to Rachel's car, I felt lighter than I had in years. Tomorrow, I would start the process of truly making this house my own again. I would paint the walls, rearrange the furniture, fill it with new memories. But tonight, I was content with the knowledge that I had taken the first step. I had come home, not just to a place, but to myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all.